right, fellow lovers of composition, Kristian Kuhn here, affectionately known as the Bob Ross of composition, with a really cool writing workshop for you today. So we are going to take a look at proposing a gradeless system synthesis essay. So all sorts of pedagogical pundits have been talking about the merits and the hang-ups of a gradeless system and the detriments of grading students and kind of the old antiquated paradigm of assigning grades. And we're going to grapple with that in this particular essay. So without further ado, before we jump in, please subscribe to my channel. It's called Kristian Kuhn, the Bob Ross of composition. If you will, hit like, leave comments, and help me beat that pesky algorithm. As far as source material for this particular unit goes, I want to help teachers and students out. So down below in the description box, you can find all the slides contained in this presentation. And you can also find a source packet. So I put together 6 sources, given that it's a synthesis essay, and that's down below in a Google slide form as well. So regarding the sources, let me say this. As my students wrote this, we found out that some of my students were requesting, hey, Mr. Kuhn, can I please, use my own source? I really want to go in this particular angle. And I think if you open up the gates to that, it's probably a good idea. I knew the direction I wanted my samples to go, so I kind of cherry-picked my sources in accordance to my thesis, and I think that's kind of a cool practice if we can get our kids to do that as well. So open that gate if you want to. So let's begin by taking a look at the prompt, and I tried to keep this in the language of all things FRQ1 AP language and composition. And I think I did a pretty fair job of that. So here is the prompt. Teachers all over the country are experimenting with what is known as going gradeless, which means that students are not evaluated with traditional letter or number-based values. A gradeless classroom can have several pros, including reduced student stress, increased focus on learning itself, and more personalized feedback. But cons include potential challenges with accountability, communication with parents, and navigating college admissions processes where grades are still often required. So let me unpack this before I show you the rest of the prompt. So I see in some former FRQ1s that the prompts are so loaded that you really can kind of get in there and self-select a thesis statement. So this prompt lists the pros and the cons. And I love it in the sense that oftentimes students struggle to come up with an authentic thesis statement. And this prompt kind of guides them towards a few possibilities, either looking at pros, cons, or they can end up qualifying it. So I think it's pretty coolly worded there. I kind of dig that. So here's the rest of the prompt. Carefully read the following 6 sources, including the introductory information for each source. Write a letter to your school board that synthesizes material from at least 3 of the sources and develops your position on the value, if any, of either continuing your district's current grading practices or switching to a gradeless paradigm. So we're going to write a letter to the school board. I have to use a minimum of 3 of the 6 sources and just follow all that English composition stuff. Easy, easy peasy. So I'm going to tell you why I've earned the name of Bob Ross of composition, Kristian Kuhn, the Bob Ross of composition. I always say you got to Bob Ross your instruction. And what I mean by that, it's simply this. You as the teacher, it's a good practice if you position yourself as the expert writer in the classroom and provide plenty of models and exemplars with your students. And it's closely akin to Bob Ross getting to the easel and the canvas and painting with and for his students. And you, in a sense, paint, and I air quote that because you're writing, you're going to paint with and for your students using heuristics. And Bob Ross used a heuristic called the wet on wet technique. And for us, as far as our introductory paragraph, we can declare or invert and use that heuristic. And then for our body paragraphs, we're going to use an Aristotelian method called the syllogistic method. And that is how we're going to cobble together the entire essay. So without further ado, let's begin with the introduction and talk about how we're going to write these. So I like to use something called the declarative and the inverted thesis. And to demonstrate, I'll go declarative first. And in this, you just begin with the thesis. So out of the gate, school board, you need to do this, right? With regards to the prompt. So students can do that very, very easily. And oftentimes, students will get through their synthesis introduction and it's like, where's the thesis? So for struggling and emerging writers, this is an easy fix to that. Just answer the question, right? Answer the essential question in the prompt in the first sentence. From there, you want to sprinkle in a little bit of context and background. This is where it gets a little tricky. I often call this setting the GPS, giving your reader the roadmap or giving your reader the compass, right? It's the directionality of the paper. My students only write 4 paragraphs on the AP language exam for all of the FRQs, and that goes for AP literature as well. We only do 4 paragraphs. And in the introduction, I like it when my students, for their context background, their GPS, their roadmap, their compass, to give the directionality of the 2 body paragraphs. Where are you going? What direction are you heading? I also like it when my students can incorporate a little bit of tier 2 level vocabulary. And all I mean by that is your average run-of-the-mill SAT level caliber words. And then those that are familiar with my work, that I'm big into Strunk and White and his rule called rule number 18, in which he espouses the idea that there's 12 different ways to construct a single sentence. And from there, from the sentence types, you can pattern them 20 different ways. In order to get voice, rhythm, and flow, all the things of nuance, pizzazz, flair, students need to be able to manipulate their syntax in order to get that certain pop quality to it, that aha factor. So I want my students to focus on the sentence constructs as well. And then introductory paragraphs, just like the essay, 4 paragraphs, we're going 4 sentences. We're going to keep that math kind of static. So an introductory paragraph is going to be exactly 4 sentences. So we can take that declarative and flip it over on its head and call it an inverted thesis heuristic. And in this, you just end with the thesis. That's the only difference. So you begin with your directionality, the context, the background, the GPS, the roadmap, the compass. You're still going to sprinkle in some tier 2 level vocab, cook up those sentence constructs, and it's going to be exactly 4 sentences long. All right, that's a lot of talking and kind of might get a little nebulous and pie in the sky unless I show you some examples. So let's unpack that. So before a writer begins to write their introductory paragraph, they really need to know their direction. Where are the body paragraphs going to go? And again, we're only doing intro, 2 bodies, and a conclusion. So you're going to give hints in your introductory paragraph to the 2 places you're going to go. So let me read this introduction from top to bottom, and then we'll unpack everything that goes into it. Here it is. By design, secondary schools are intended to be microcosms of the real world. Bubbled and sheltered to an extent, these institutions have a responsibility nonetheless to prepare their students for what lies beyond the confines of their instructional practices. While the grading system might appear at face value to be antiquated and arcane, eliminating it under the guise of a mental health band-aid does not serve children whatsoever at all, nor is taking such a measure replicating the next phase of the student's life. Further, some form of tangible evaluation system is needed to determine things such as college and career preparedness. All right, so let's identify where the thesis is first. It's in the last sentence. You can see there that the essential question is answered in that last sentence, all right, that we need a system of evaluation. We need grades. Let's talk about the compass, the roadmap, the GPS. So in the last sentence, we talk about college and career preparedness. We talk about the real world, and we talk about mental health. So the body paragraphs are going to discuss those things, right? So you're going to have one body paragraph in which, some of the pro gradeless crowd talk about how grades stress kids out too much and lead to mental health issues, the anxiety, the depression, all that kind of stuff. So we're going to tackle that in one body paragraph. But then in the other body paragraph, we're going to talk about how secondary schools are microcosms of the real world. And in the real world, you're evaluated, and that's just the nature of the beast. And to safeguard kids from that is not preparation for real world readiness. So that's the direction we're going to go with that. You can see that the vocab is really nice without overdoing it. So I like words like even simple things like by design, microcosms, institutions, nonetheless, instructional practices, antiquated, arcane, right? Guys. So really good vocab, but it stays in the writer's wheelhouse. Nothing sounds forced, nothing sounds contrived. Now let's talk about sentence constructs. Here's my rule for this. I always tell my students that repetition is the bane of the writer's existence. So eyeball sentence number 1. Do you see how it just goes by design, comma, and then a relatively short sentence? We don't want to replicate that sentence pattern in sentence number 2. We want number 2 to be really different than number 1. And you can see that it is. And then number 3 is different from number 2 and number 1. And then number 4 is also rather unique. Number 4 is kind of similar to number 1, but it's okay because it's been some time since we wrote a sentence like that. So all the sentences need to be varied. You need to stagger the pattern and crank different sentence constructs throughout this in order to get voice, rhythm, and flow. And one of the things you'll see in my student examples is that my students know how to use semicolons and colons and dashes and parenthetical statements and all that stuff. That's something that we do in our Nuance Academy that I build around the Strunk and White text. So at this stage of the year, they're all good with that. All right, so that's one example. Let's paint it again, and just to really demystify it. And again, before the student writes, they need to know their direction. Where are the body paragraphs going? So here's an example. Extrinsic motivational factors are needed to keep a teenager on the right academic path. Left to their own devices, most young scholars lack the internal drive, discipline, and habits of mind to be self-guided learners. As such, eliminating grading paradigms would be akin to denying the adult worker their salary. The reality is this: we live in a world that functions upon a system of rewards and punishments. Therefore, the proverbial carrot must be dangled. All right, so this is pretty cool here. So again, it's the same as number 1. So the thesis is either going to be first sentence or last sentence. And you can see here that it's in the last sentence, so this is inverted. Let's talk about directionality. This is focusing a lot on extrinsic versus intrinsic motivational factors. So one paragraph is going to be extrinsic and the other is going to be intrinsic, and the concept that students need some kind of motivation in order to strive towards success. Otherwise, you're going to kind of demoralize the process and disincentivize the process and have, lackluster schooling of, disaffected youth not doing what they need to do. Now, in terms of sentence constructs, let's break something down here. If you take a look at sentence number 2, this is a pattern that Strunk and White talk about. It's called a trio. So you can see, left to their own devices, most young scholars lack the internal drive, 1, discipline, 2, habits of mind, 3. So Strunk and White talk about layering like that. And I have some videos in my YouTube channel that go over all 20 of those patterns. So if you want your students to be able to wield sentences like that, get into those videos and those instructions and give your kids a whirl at that. This is pretty cool when students can do that. So you can see here there's clear directionality, there's a clear thesis, vocab is up, and the sentence constructs are also cooking in this. So you got that trio in there, and then The last sentence is also pretty cool. And this is what I like to do when I model for my students when I Bob Ross. Just show them tricks that I want them to try out. What a funky sentence that last one is. It's got a colon and a semicolon and a comma in it. And again, you don't want to go willy-nilly with the syntax, but an occasional complex sentence every now and then really bodes well for the writer. And again, you're just going for variety. You're staggering for the voice, the rhythm, and the flow. So I know some students, some teachers might be looking at this saying, my kids can't do that. Or your student yourself watching this saying, I can't do that. You can. It takes a little bit of practice. It's really not that hard. So let's see it one more time here. Again, I'll read it from top to bottom, and then we'll deconstruct it together. The educational system and the meat industry have one thing in common. They both want to churn out mass quantities of grade A product. But therein lies the problem. Students are not docile cattle or free-range chickens. As such, the grading system really needs to be amended in ways that are much more authentic to the experience of the learner. Instead of using an antiquated warehousing paradigm, contemporary society should embrace other means of evaluating their scholars. Thesis, thesis, thesis. Where's the thesis? It comes last sentence. And this is something that I discovered through writing this, and this is the beauty of Bob Rossing your instruction. I found it for this particular prompt to be a lot easier to invert than to declare. I felt that the reader needed some context and some background with the rhetorical situation before I clobbered them with, yes, go gradeless. No, don't go gradeless. Keep it. I felt they needed a little bit of background information before, introducing the thesis statement. So again, you can see I'm doing all sorts of cool things at sentence level. I got a colon in there. I got a dash. Just some basic independent clauses. So there's variety and variation in all of those. My vocab's up, and then the directionality is very, very clear, right, in terms of where the body paragraphs are going to go. So that's all you got to do. Give the hint, the nod of the hat to the two directions you're going in the body paragraphs, and place a thesis first sentence or place it fourth sentence, and off you're running. Out of the gates, you got blazing speed. So at this stage of the game, how about we give it a whirl, hit the pause button, students, give it a try. And then one thing that I like to do, teachers, is once students are done, take a look at a few student examples. I just ask for some volunteers, or I, just kind of walk around the room and say, hey, you got a killer introduction. Can we please show this to the class? And you can do it anonymously, or if the kid wants to identify, you can identify. But it's always good practice for students to see other students writing. I think, firmly in the philosophy that the more good writing a student sees, the better writer they can become. Writing's a game of emulation. We really need to see good writing, and a lot of it, in order to become good writers. So I'll show you what my students were doing for their introductions. I'll give you two examples. And again, one of the things I do before students write is I might on like a sticky note or something on their desk say, write down your direction. Where are you going? Where are your body paragraphs going? Because if they're kind of setting sail without setting the GPS, it's going to get pretty wayward and waylaid pretty fast. So they really need to know their direction before they write. So I have them articulate that on a Post-it note or an index card. So this is student example number one. I'll go really, really fast through this just so that you can get a sense. Like it or not, we are not a give me something for nothing culture. In fact, the entire arrangement is built upon a system of rewards and punishments. If one is leagues ahead of his peers academically, he's destined to become the valedictorian. And if one excels in business, it stands to reason that he will climb to the corporate ladder and one day become CEO. As Pavlovian as it may sound, this is how things work. So eliminating the grading system is a mere failure to acknowledge the inner machinations of real-world exchanges. Very cool. I love how this reads. It's really smooth. It's really supple, really fluid. has good voice rhythm flow, and out of the gate, they're with blazing speed. So manifest in it, you can see the two directions that it's going. Vocab's up, sentence constructs are absolutely on fuego. Really, really, really good voice rhythm and flow. And I think any AP reader would look at that introduction and say, wow, if this kid can keep this up, I definitely am going to give them the sophistication point. This is really, really, really well done. So let's take a look at one more. And again, on that notepad, I circle around the room and I'm like, let's make sure on the posting note that you know your direction, because without direction, you can't write this. Behavioral scientists have known for decades the negative consequences on performance levels of being under too much stress. So that's going to be a body paragraph. We're going to take a look at mental health as it correlates to grades. Whether the test subjects be rats or teenage students, one eventually crumbles beneath the weight of extraneous pressure. So that is one such body paragraph. And this is exactly what the current constitution of our grading system does. It causes far too many pupils to intellectually shut down and underperform. As such, a radical rethinking needs to be had with regards to how students are evaluated and assessed. So that new paradigm is going to be the other body paragraph. So two directions, sentence constructs, thesis either first or last. And you can see my students put theirs last. It's like pretty much everyone inverted with this one. That just seems to be the way they fell off the pen. And that is the introduction, and that's how you do it. So that's 5 examples of how to crank these, and they're all done the same way. That's the beauty of heuristics. It takes the guesswork out of it. It completely demystifies how to do things. So let's transition away from the introductory paragraph and ask ourselves this question: how do I write the bodies? We know that we're going to do 2 of them, right? 4-paragraph essay, intro, 2 bodies, conclusion. And I already alluded to this. We're going to use an Aristotelian heuristic known as the syllogistic method. And all this is when you go from premise, conclusion. And I'll give you a kind of a morbid example here. If I were to say arsenic is deadly, and then I was followed up by premise 2 and say, yeah, this morning, I went out in the kitchen to make a cup of coffee, and there's little Skipper underneath the kitchen sink, and all over his muzzle and his grizzle, there's all this white stuff. And you'd be like, what, Kristian? Yeah, I rats in my house, and I put arsenic underneath my kitchen sink. You would say, oh no, Kristian, your dog's going to die. That's cogency. That's logic that either induce or deduce logically. And that's all writing is. Really is good thinking is good writing. Good writing is good thinking. And that's what we're teaching our kids to do. And this syllogistic method heuristic is just a way to get kids to think cogently on paper. And Aristotle used the word cogent. I use it as well. In AP circles, we talk about the line of reasoning. All a line of reasoning is a syllogism. In order to get kids to write a clear, cogent line of reasoning, they must create syllogistic constructs. So let's talk about what this syllogistic method looks like for the purposes of writing a synthesis paper. The first premise is going to be an argument that contains a why reason. Let me explain this. I'm going to model the first premise a lot because this is where wheels fall off the essay. A why reason. So up top in the introductory paragraph, we don't state why we are espousing a certain thesis. We just state the thesis. We say yes, no, or qualify to the essential question in the prompt. In the first premise, we get into the whys. Why do we need to go gradeless? Why do we need to keep the current paradigm intact, right? And that's going to take 3 sentences. We have to keep the centrality of the argument. And the prompt talks about that a lot, right? Your argument must be central. So if the student begins to quote or paraphrase in sentence 1, 2, or 3, then the centrality of the argument is lost. And basically, in effect, the kid's plagiarizing, and we don't want that. So if they take 3 sentences and really clearly articulate a why reason, they're going to have a centralized argument that is authentic. Beginning in the fourth sentence, we want our textual support, and we're going to teeter-totter balance the quoting and the paraphrasing. And I always like it when my students draw 3 quotes or paraphrases, a blend. So three levels of textual support in here, because synthesis, not by definition, but by theory, is a pluralistic word. You got to be doing it a few times within the body paragraph in order to synthesize. And I think 3 is a minimum expectation for that. 2's not enough. 1's definitely not enough. So 3 times seems to be sufficient. From there, you got to keep in mind that body paragraphs need to be concluded. All too often, kids will run away at a quote or a paraphrase in there. Like they ditch the body paragraph. Everything needs to link, echo, promise back to the prompt, back to the thesis, back to the origins of the first premise. So there's math to this. First premise, 3 sentences. I like to see 3 quotes and or paraphrases in it. And a syllogistic body paragraph is going to total 10 to 12 sentences, right? So you got these big paragraphs, those little itty bitty 3-4 sentence baggers that kids write. There's not enough support or analysis in there to really advance an argument. So let's ask ourselves this question. How do you write a first premise? What does that actually look like? So I have some stems for struggling emerging writers. So if it's your first synthesis essay, maybe you want to equip your kids with this. And if they say reason why, they will articulate a reason why. It's just kind of a foolproof method. So you can say there's a clear reason as to why, or there are a couple of reasons why. So again, if you say reason why, you will by default drop your reason why. So let me give you a full 3 sentences of that. There is one principal reason why going gradeless is a terrible idea. Student motivation. Grades, in many ways, are the only Pavlovian carrot that we dangle before a student's nose. Without it, some other extrinsic motivator must be introduced, such as financial compensation or material rewards. So when I get to the end of a first premise, I always say, what's the promise of the first premise? Because if you keep your promise, you keep the line of reasoning. You have a cogent syllogism. And this one's very clear. All we're going to talk about is intrinsic and extrinsic motivational factors that students need to work towards some extrinsic goal in order to be self-motivated. There needs to be something outside of themselves that they're working toward. And all my quotes and paraphrases need to be germane and relevant to that particular promise. Otherwise, I'm going to break my line of reasoning. So at the 4th sentence, I would begin to quote and or paraphrase, blend those, teeter-totter balance those. So again, quick recap here. First premise, 3 sentences, argue a reason why, and then let's do this. What's the promise of the first premise, right? Let's see it one more time, right? So here's a totally different one. 3 sentences, and I'm going to get rid of the stem and just state the reason why without that there is a reason why stem. For decades, the collegiate system has been stratified on the traditional grading system. As such, exceptional scholars find entrance into the likes of the Ivy and Patriot Leagues, while less capable students go to less rigorous and prestigious schools. So eliminating grades not only renders the college admission process impossible, but a gradeless system is a system that demotivates exceptionalism. All right, what's the promise of the first premise? College admissions. How in the heck are we going to, get kids to their respective colleges where they fit and belong, and based on a meritocracy? Right? So students merit getting into the Ivy Leagues, into the Patriot Leagues. They merit going to community colleges. How do we calculate that? How do we keep that system in play if we get rid of grades? So all the quotes and paraphrases need to link up to the promise of that first premise, right? What is the promise of the first premise? So that's what we always got to ask ourselves at the end of those 3 sentences. Let's see it one more time. Really shore it up here. Given the nation's mental health crisis, it only makes sense to remove one needless thing from students' plates: grades. Not only do grades not measure what they largely purport, aptitude, potential, achievement, but they cause unwarranted opportunities for crisis. To safeguard from such occurrences and to augment learning, which is why kids go to school in the first place, better systems need to be put into place. A very clear promise of first premise, right? So you've got to articulate those things as clearly as possible. And then all the quotes and paraphrases need to link up to that. I'm just going to take 3 sentences. So 3 for 3, let's talk about what's not in here. You're not going to have any source material. Don't talk about any of the sources. Don't quote, don't paraphrase. It is just you mano a mano with your argument, all right, in order to keep that central. So from here, what the student needs to do is to go quote hunting, right? Go find the quotes and the paraphrases that are going to absolutely ensure that you have a line of reasoning and that you have a real tight, cogent, syllogistic body paragraph. So let's move into the second premise, which is our support and analysis. So take a look here. In the 4th sentence, you just get into your quotes and your paraphrases, into the source material. So let's take a look at this. 4th sentence. In a recent study conducted by Johns Hopkins University and Mark Wilcox, it is reported that a mere 6.7% of teenagers possess the requisite intrinsic motivational skills to put forth maximum effort in the absence of a reward-based system of measurement. Source D. So usually in the 4th sentence, I like to get a source in there, whether it's a direct quote or a paraphrase. Let's talk about a heuristic within the heuristic. How do you get kids to embed their quotes and have them be silky smooth? I call it the 5-word rule. If you place a minimum of 5 words in front of the quote, so not exactly 5, but a minimum of 5, keep the quote relatively small, then it should sound conversational, but you will need to teach kids how to bracket, of course, so that it stays conversational. This one did not require any brackets. So you quote, you got to analyze it. So look at the transition here. Given this bleak statistic, what is this? The quote, the statistic, the 6.7. You got to analyze that. One must ask the following question. What will motivate a scholar to learn if the sole extrinsic reward, grades, are removed? The answer is simple. Not only will students intellectually disengage, but secondary schools will be nothing more and nothing less than, and I'm going to continue on the next screen here, breeding grounds of apathy, disengagement, and mental sloth. Source C. So you can see there, I've quoted twice now. So I'm using a variety of sources. And every time you quote, you got to analyze. And one of the things that I said earlier is this: repetition is the bane of the writer's existence. Oftentimes, students will do one sentence analysis after every quote. And that also needs to be staggered and varied. So after the first quote, I had 3 sentences of transition and analysis. Look what I have here after source C. Given that the typical teenager is conditioned to work for reward, one system must replace the current system if learning is to occur. Since schools are microcosms of the real world, perhaps the reward system could model itself after the corporate paradigm and institute a payment system that sets into place a stratified scale that sees students working toward becoming the CEOs of their classes. Source A. Very cool. So you can see here inside the syllogistic body paragraph, I usually have 3 quotes and or paraphrases. All right. And you can reuse the same source twice, but I tell my students twice and that's it. In every respect, this would eliminate the college admissions conundrum in that the chief executives gain entrance into the more elite institutions. So I hammered home that analysis in 1 sentence. But I'm not done. I got to wrap this all up and get back to the prompt and back to the thesis. And this usually takes 2 or 3 sentences. All right. And again, this is how you wrap up the body paragraph. Clearly, students need to work towards something extrinsic of themselves. whether it be numerical grades, money, or corporate promotions. Some system needs to be instituted to rank and evaluate the learning of the student. Without such measures, there's no way to assess and evaluate the end goal of education, the actual learning of the child. So you can hear the reverberations of the thesis statement in there. All right, so it all comes full circle. You go back to the prompt, you go back to the thesis, and it just takes 2 or 3 sentences. So all in all, you're shooting for 10 to 12 sentences. I think that one went a little bit over. I think that was 13 sentences. It's totally cool because it stayed focused, but you don't want to get into like 16, 17, 18 sentences, because otherwise you're just bloviating and going on and on and on and on and on. And you end up getting a little discursive when you do that. So keep it around 10 to 12. Question becomes, what do I do next? Boom, you bust out another syllogism. And this is the space where oftentimes I have students do their rebuttals and their concessions. And again, we're doing intro, 2 bodies, and a conclusion. So the heuristic just recycles itself. So let's take a look at a first premise. And then, if your students want to finish this on their own, they can. I'm just going to model the first premise for you, and then you can have them go get the quotes that they need for it from the source packet, and you can practice a syllogistic body paragraph just by stealing my first premise here, and they can finish it off with their own quote hunting. But there's also a differing perspective on the issue that must be acknowledged and addressed. So this sounds like concession language here. One can easily concede to the fact that there is at present a mental health crisis running rampant at the secondary level. And if one investigates into the matter, the grading system is a lead factor in contributing to the overall anxiety, depression, and mental decline of the average teenage student. What's the promise of the first premise? We have got to be talking about mental health in this syllogistic body paragraph, and that a gradeless system may, in fact, help with mental health. Who knows? So the quotes and paraphrases need to link up to that, be germane to that. We have to keep the promise of the first premise. So let's go get 3 quotes, just like the first one we did. Or you can paraphrase, it doesn't matter, just 3 citations, and work it into that body paragraph. So real quick, let's wrap the essay up and talk about the conclusion paragraph. I like to use some stems early in the year just to teach this concept. So I liken the conclusion paragraph to the grand finale of a fireworks display, like a 4th of July fireworks display. It's the big encapsulation. It's the all-encompassing thematic gist of everything you've done so far. Big theme fireworks. So stems like simply said, evidentially, in no other words, when it's all said and done, at the end of the day, are encapsulating statements. So students, feel free to steal one of those stems, and I'll give you a full one right here just to give you a sense of how to do it. So it's going to take 3 to 4 sentences is all you need for a conclusion paragraph. In no other words, adopting a gradeless paradigm is an antithetical measure that would cause the education system to implode. Like it or not, human behavior is often motivated by the allure of extrinsic rewards. Removing these factors not only disincentivizes learning, but it demotivates students from striving for excellence and success. As such, the best change is to change nothing as far as evaluation of learning is concerned. Boom, we're done. The whole essay is written. That's it. A couple of heuristics, right, can get you through the whole thing. So happy teaching, happy writing. If you need to get in touch with me, you can drop me an email at teachingwritingcoach@gmail.com. Know that I do offer PD sessions. So I have been working a lot one-on-one with teachers, and I've also been working with departments as well, like groups of like 4, 5, 6 people in a department. So if you would like for me to host any PD sessions, you can take a look at my website, teachinghowtowrite.com, or email me and we can talk specifics about that. I do this all the time. I've worked throughout the country, giving PD, to a wide array of districts, departments, and have helped out a lot of teachers. So if you're interested in working together, just give me a holler either way. That's it. That's the end. I hope you like this presentation, and I'll keep them coming, and I'll see you in just a little bit.